Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to share our novel method that was part of our capstone project conducted in the spring of 2021. I'm Lucas. I'm here with Fabio and Mohamed. Jaman and Sarah also form part of our team, but unfortunately, they couldn't make it today. We all graduated this past May from the Information Security Policy and Management program at Carnegie Mellon. We work in conjunction with the Software Engineering Institute for this project, and that is why Brett Tucker from ECI, our advisor, is also part of the team. Here's our agenda. We'll first look into some background context of our project, introduce the project scope, and then go in depth on our process. We will leave a few minutes at the end for some Q&A. Great. In order to bring everybody to the same level of understanding, let's get into some background context for this project. Many regulations across industries today require security risk assessments and control baseline implementation. One such implementation is NIST 853. And just in case, for anyone that's not familiar, NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have several standards, and the 853 series define the standards and guidelines for agencies to manage information security systems. It was established to provide guidance for the protection of private data. So entities that need to follow this risk management approach to deal with cybersecurity threats in a regulated environment might need additional guidance for prioritizing IT-related risks. No doubt about that if we add the fact that in the last 15 years, data breaches have increased more than 600%, and cybercrime losses almost exceeded $950 billion. There has been a push and a need to better secure systems, and federal organizations might be obligated to comply with at least 300 controls, or even more. Yes, 300 NIST controls out of a possible 999 are a lot. So how do we select these controls? The selection of controls usually follows market trends or frameworks, but regardless, they still need to be adapted to the organization's specific context. And in this journey, CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, do struggle to prioritize and justify the selection of controls that will be implemented from a cost-benefit perspective. So ultimately, many organizations cannot answer these two questions, which are, how much less risk will they have if they spend a given budget on certain security controls, and which controls should be prioritized and implemented? For these questions, we wanted to provide an answer. This is the very general overview of what we achieved, which is to structure and build a method, as well as a parallel prototype tool for analyzing and estimating the impact that a given set of controls would have on cybersecurity risks and on the reduction of financial loss. We build upon established frameworks and resources, including FAIR, which is used for risk quantification, OCTAVE Allegro, which is used for risk assessment, MITRE, which is used for threat capability, and NIST, which is used to protect private data. I will also add that the link up between all these frameworks and resources is novel and hasn't been done before, which is one reason we are really excited about this project. Great, now that we established the background and scope, let's get now into the details of our method. What is our main objective? What are we looking for here? We want to give organizations the necessary artifacts to develop their cybersecurity strategies. So we are going to help CISOs in their cybersecurity strategy development by enabling them to prioritize compliance requirements, information security plans, and cybersecurity investments. And all this within a foundation of risk-based decision-making. All in all, giving CISOs a tool for budget allocation and justification, helping them decide which set of controls to implement that, given a certain budget, will provide them the least residual risk. Thus, giving them the ability to justify their budget to upper management. But how exactly our method is going to help CISOs? Within this slide, we include a CISO's mind map. That is just a summary of what CISOs need to have in mind. Our method mainly focuses on the three green boxes, the risk-related ones. The red boxes represent the different types of frameworks that, as we mentioned before, our method is built upon. For example, we use guide frameworks to help us translate an organization risk appetite into an actual input for our method. Our method main focus is on the bottom yellow box, the control strategy. As this is an express impact method, it helps CISOs select a set of controls to implement. So in a nutshell, our method helps to map the requirements of the different frameworks into organization-specific security objectives to help CISOs translate them into actionable cybersecurity initiatives. Our method consists of 3 main stages, as we can see in the macro process included in the slide. The first stage aims to determine the risk tolerance that the organization has. In other words, how much risk are we willing to tolerate? The second stage will use various inputs, frameworks, and mappings to determine the inherent risk. The inherent risk represents the actual risk of the organization with our current set of implemented controls and threat landscape. The third stage will prioritize the high-impact risks, and then it will address the set of controls that are needed to improve the risk treatment strategy of the organization. In other words, if we implement this set of controls, given our current budget, how much our residual risk is going to vary. Lastly, our method outputs 2 loss exceedance scores, as we can see on the slide. One for each risk type, tolerance, inherent, and residual, and another one for each risk event considered within our model. Well, let's start analyzing stage 1 of our method, risk tolerance. In order to determine the risk tolerance of an organization, this stage will undergo 3 main steps to achieve this objective. First, we use a custom modified OCTAVE questionnaire to gauge some data and variables from the organization. After that, we translate and analyze this information into an actionable risk tolerance approach. Finally, we compute the risk tolerance by drawing the curve to represent the willingness to risk of that organization. This quickly summarizes the first stage of our method. So that concludes stage 1, but for stage 2, we have to first mention a few things. For our method, we use predefined risk events, depicted from MITRE impact and exfiltration tactics. These events represent a cyber kill chain detailing the needed TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures to execute a cyber kill chain. But let us detail this a little bit more. We are detailing here MITRE's tactics and cyber kill chain. We'll focus mainly on the attack right-hand section. From the kill chain, each risk event was defined as a set of steps that were associated with MITRE's TTPs that hackers can use to complete an attack. Let's zoom in the highlighted section, credential access, to give a little more detail in the following slide. For each attack corresponding to the kill chain, MITRE lists adversary techniques for this attack. For example, some of the techniques for credential access that we can see on the slide are brute force, input capture, forced authentication, among others. These TTPs are then mapped to MITRE mitigations. However, these mitigations provided by MITRE are quite abstract, so we decided to use NIST controls. For that, we created a custom mapping between MITRE mitigations and NIST controls. Thus, we only use MITRE mitigations as a proxy. Lastly, before we deep dive into stage 2, we need to highlight the FAIR ontology. We will use this ontology to calculate the risk for each risk event. And thus, you will hear us reference this FAIR tree many times in the following slides. As a brief recap, the left-hand side of the tree is the one related to loss frequency. It is the probability side of the tree, whereas the right-hand side specifically addresses the impacts of risks. I will now leave you with Mohammed, who is going to give more detail about stage 2 of our method.
Thank you very much, Lucas. So for stage 2, the main objective of the stage is to use FAIR framework to compute the risk and calculate the loss exceedance curve. This stage will undergo 5 main steps. First, the organization will need to fill in a NIST compliance questionnaire and a risk event questionnaire, which are depicted from NIST 853 controls and OCTAVE Allegro templates. Then we will calculate the threat vulnerability score based on the information collected from the questionnaires. And finally, we'll conclude the stage by being able to compute the risk and calculate the risk exceedance curve. For the risk event questionnaire, we use a modified version of OCTAVE Allegro templates to ask the organization for their estimates for the threat event frequency and the impact boundaries for the predefined risk events. Threat event frequency is the probable frequency within a year that a threat agent will act against the organization and cause a loss. Questions will be in the form of what are the upper and lower boundaries for the impact estimated for a ransomware attack, for example, and what is the frequency of a ransomware occurrence in your organization over the past year. The second step in the compliance questionnaire is the compliance questionnaire. Based on the selected risk event, the associated NIST 853 controls are used as an input to create a questionnaire to inquire about the organization compliance level for each control. This is entered in a percentage between 0 and 100%. Okay, so based on the risk event questionnaire, the threat event frequency and loss magnitude in the FAIR ontology are now addressed. This is represented in the green boxes in the FAIR ontology, as you can see in the slide. In the next slide, we will take a deep dive into the difficulty factor presented in the blue box in the ontology. Okay, so the left side of the ontology illustrates the inputs used to estimate the difficulty factor, which while the right-hand side estimates and shows the inputs to estimate the threat capability. I will first start by explaining how we estimated the difficulty factor as presented in the blue boxes. Adversarial techniques are mapped to mitigation techniques using MITRE attack framework, as Lucas explained earlier. In our contribution, we have mapped these mitigations to NIST 853 controls to have a more specific scope for the organization to follow. And then this table will show you a deep dive into how mitigations were mapped to multiple NIST controls and what are the applicable FAIR factors. This shall aid CISOs to formalize their cyber investment strategies and comply with government regulations. Okay, as a result, as represented in the green boxes, we have estimated the difficulty factor. And now we'll focus on the right-hand side, which is a threat capability calculation, as represented in the blue and the red box and the blue boxes, sorry, in the ontology, and as a second main input for the vulnerability estimation. Okay, the left table was created using a Python script. So we created a Python script to crawl the threat communities and their hacking techniques in MITRE's website. And then the right-hand side of the slide shows a table that was created after we manually classified the threat communities to either state-sponsored groups or cyber criminal groups using MITRE websites too. And then we calculated the TARA susceptibility for each tactic and technique for each threat group. This was done by dividing how many threat communities use a specific technique by the total number of groups that were identified by MITRE. We then used open source intelligence reports, such as Verizon Data Breach Report from 2020, to estimate how many attacks are performed by state-sponsored groups and cyber criminals in a given year. The data was then used from the threat intelligence report to estimate the overall threat capability score. Okay, as a result, we have gathered all the inputs needed for the vulnerability estimation. And now I will hand it over to Fabio to speak about the vulnerability estimation.
Thank you, Mohammed. So as Mohammed explained, we structured the backend method and mapping to support the FAIR factors computing using threat intelligence information, risk modeling methods, and control implementation. We connected different frameworks. One of the most important contributions of this work is how we calculated the vulnerability factor expected values to introduce the controls impact. Recall that the vulnerability factor in FAIR is composed by threat capability and difficulty factors. Threat capability is calculated using TARA scores based on based on a relative value of the TTPs that are used by each threat community. If the threat community uses more TTPs, the score is higher because it has higher capabilities. And on the other hand, as Mohammed also explained, we have the difficulty factor that is calculated from the controls implementation level. In this stage, we have used the mapping between NIST controls, TTPs, MITRE mitigations, and FAIR factors to calculate the average effectiveness of each control. The effectiveness of each control was calculated based on how many TTPs the controls address and how likely is that each control cut the kill chain of each risk event. Thus, average effectiveness will estimate the criticality of each control in respect to the mitigation of each TTP used in all risk events that we model. Afterwards, the vulnerability factor of the organization in respect to every single event was calculated by finding the product of the inverse controls average effectiveness and the threat capability for each risk event. Recall that the vulnerability factor at FAIR method is interpreted as the probability of getting a loss event given a threat event. Thus, if unlikely the control effectiveness is 100%, the vulnerability factor would be 0. This diagram shows us in the FAIR ontology where we are. Once we have the vulnerability score, we need to introduce the threat event frequency in order to get the loss event frequency and transform it into a probability of occurrence so that we can use it in the simulation process. The probability of a loss event is conditional to the threat occurrence. So for calculating this factor, we multiply the vulnerability factor with the threat event frequency that we get from the organization inputs. In this example, we have that this specific organization had 5 ransomware threat events last year and a vulnerability factor of 2.62%. Thus, the probability of getting a ransomware loss event is 13% based on the simulation. Now we are ready to introduce the monetary values to the occurrence of those loss events. Remember that the user gave us, or the organization gave us potential impact boundaries from the questionnaires explained before. Questionnaires for risk appetite and questionnaires for monetary input. We use this to simulate the losses on the specific organization context, and we proceed to prioritize the risk events based on which ones have higher expected impact. This will help us to identify a prioritized list of controls. In this example, is the same organization. We show the values that are used by calculating the risk impact. For example, for ransomware loss event, we have that 70% of ransomware events, the 70% of ransomware events impact only availability of information, and 30% impacts confidentiality and availability. These statistics came from the Verizon data breach investigation report. Also, for this example, we have that the impact boundaries that the organization defined are explained here. Note that we don't define a specific expected loss because there is no organization sure about that. We use ranges because we need to consider the uncertainty behind the risk estimations that the organization had. This idea came from Hubbard Research program, so we took some information from them. The larger the range is here, the higher the uncertainty. That's the main idea. So having both probability of loss event and impact boundaries, we proceed to simulate the risk using Monte Carlo simulations with 10,000 scenarios for our program. Each risk event impact is modeled as a log normal distribution, and the probability of occurrence is modeled as a negative binomial distribution, which is supported by different research initiatives, such as the International Monetary Fund Cyber Risk Modeling Program and others. The outcome of this step is a loss exceedance curve for the aggregated loss events. This representation will tell us how probable it is to have a loss that exceeds a specific value. For our example case, after the simulations, we have that this organization, the same organization we have talked before, have an expected loss of about $700,000 and a probability of 10% to lose more than $1 million from the model loss events. Now that we have modeled the risk events and simulated the losses on the specific organization context, we proceed to prioritize the risk events based on which ones have higher expected impact. This will help us to identify prioritized list of controls. For this part, we propose to select the risk that contribute more to the overall risk curve and suggest a set of controls that could address the highest impact risks. This could guide the organization to select an optimal control implementation strategy, which in fact can be tested using the same method and tool we designed. In this case, we have that of the example organization. The 4 highest impact risks were ransomware loss event, data manipulation, denial of service, and disk swipe, with its corresponding expected losses, as we can see here. Finally, once we have deprioritized risks, we generate a limited list of controls that address the most of the TTPs that compose the prioritized risks. Then the user can modify the selected list of controls, tune the list of controls implementation values to simulate how much the improvement of those controls or implementing more controls would reduce risks, which is finally what will support the security budget decisions and risk communication strategies. So yeah, what we expect from this work is to support the idea that any security investment and decision should be supported by a risk analysis, which doesn't have to be that time consuming as it is today. So we're ready now to questions and answers. Thank you for having us.
Great, Mohammed, Fabio, Lucas, thank you very much for your presentation and sharing your expertise with the Flowcon community. First question for you guys. Maybe I'll point this to Lucas. And Lucas, if it's not best for you, that you can farm it out to Mohammed or Fabio. So the question is, with such a robust process, how do you incorporate managing expectations from C-suite stakeholders who may have unreasonable expectations about just how much you can control costs in an environment where you cannot cost predict every eventuality?
Yeah, I can take this. Right now, SENS is conducting a survey about risk quantification methods and how organizations are asking more from that perspective. The thing is, C-level people in many cases don't understand cybersecurity technical things or controls implementation or technology background reasons we can give them, but they understand about risks. They understand about financial risks. They understand about operational risks, because usually they talk about that in every meeting. So if we reach to them with risks data, with simulation results that we took from our technical analysis of the risks and of our controls implementation process, we can communicate to them what we need to support the security budgets.
Great. Next one, we have one from Jane, and maybe we'll point this one to Mohammed. And Mohammed, if it's not for you, you can pass it to a colleague. Jane asks, is the assumption that all the data provided on the questionnaires are honest and correct, or are there methods to verify the authenticity of the data which are at the core of the model?
Okay, the assumption that all the data is provided is correct. So whoever is going to implement who's going to utilize the solution could go on and depend on any internal reports within the organization. So for example, what we have in our company, we have loss prevention and safety reports, for example, which give you an estimation of any business impact boundaries that you could have in case something goes wrong or a system fails. And on the other hand, compliance reports would give you an estimate of how much compliance and how much maturity you have against a set of controls. So these could be utilized to verify the authenticity internally within the organization. But in short, yes, the expectation is that all the values provided within the questionnaires are honest and aiming to determine the risk in an honest way.
Yeah, I would complement something there. The questionnaire objective is not oriented to the honest, if the data is honest and correct, or the true about the data they give to the questionnaires. The objective of the questionnaires is to give the organization guidance to gather the information that we need for the method, so that the method could work with data and not subjective information mostly.
Great. Let's pose a question here for Fabio. Why did you guys choose to use the MITRE attack framework?
Okay, it's almost the same reason we use the questionnaires we designed. Almost most of the SIM tools or EDR tools or XDR tools now map the events to MITRE TTPs, so that we can use information from those tools to as inputs for our method, so that organizations are able to gather information from their own tools and give us to the method, so that the method could work easily and in a timely manner.
Okay, let's start with Lucas on this one from Jim asking, for the ransomware example, there are lots of ways revenue can be lost. Lost due to systems being down, ransom being paid, stock prices going down. Do you model all of the sources of loss?
The thing we wanted to keep it as a questionnaire open to organizations in order to give a few liberty, more liberty for organizations to input the data. That's the main thing here. We didn't want it to close it, okay, fill out these boxes, but we think that it can be modeled and can evolve in order to get that. And I think Fabio also wants to give a little bit more detail with that.
For the, I think the question is more oriented to the part of the impact boundaries. The impact boundaries are oriented to give the liberty to the user or the organization to not be sure about how much they are talking about. So to consider the uncertainty they have, because they have it, we need to consider we cannot only avoid to model that uncertainty. But also the method considers specific statistics methodologies, so that the subjective information the organization gives us is tuned and is not just subjective. They have some filters about it.
Okay, Vince asked, if you wanted to continue this research effort, how would you refine it? What would you want to do next?
Yeah, we have, I would say that one of the most important next steps is related to give it more statistics robustness, so that we can from statistics fill our gray areas we all already identified here. And also we used for our methodology and method, we used NIST 853 controls revision 4. We need to use revision 5, which we released last year, and the last revision of MITRE attack metrics. So yeah, we need to upgrade that part, and make more robust our statistics background.
I would add also to what Fabio mentioned that a few modules could be implemented. For example, instead of using NIST 53, we could consider other control frameworks, for example, ISO 27001, ECI, or any other one that needs to be input or by a compliance requirement of the organization. Because we did the capstone with the Software Engineering Institute, we were oriented to select NIST 53.
Great, Mohammed, Fabio, Lucas, thank you very much for presenting at FlowCon. Hopefully we can get an update at next year's event in Santa Fe.
Thank you, Sean, for having us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.